So, Jane,
Hey,
Jane
hi.
Hall. Hi. We're going to be interviewing you today, and I'm just going to say a little bit about your background.
I
You
was
have
thinking about it more like a friendly chat than an interview. Talking about an interview
it,
makes me feel a bit nervous. But
yes, friendly chat. That's exactly what it is. I'm very curious about your background.
Hmm.
I'll just say a few things. Jane has several degrees, one in social work, one in criminology, and some others miscellaneous, she said, in political science, things like that. So she came well prepared to do her work in the beginning. I think she first started off in doing social work in the coal mines, right, with the homeless. So then
Not on the streets in
on the
London. Oh, I think
streets of London,
yeah, at the coal face. So,
the coal face. Yes,
yeah,
that's
by which I mean like, on the streets of London, actually.
yeah,
So,
yeah, that's very interesting. So then you wanted to more get to the roots of the problems, right? And you found your way into prison work with Peter.
mhm.
And so you've had something like 19 years doing prison work with Dialogue
Yeah,
Associates. Yeah,
more than that. So, yeah, so it was a bit of a longer route. So after my first kind of degree in university, I was working in London with people who were homeless. And as you
right,
say, I was, after 5 years of trying to deal with all the symptoms, try and find housing, try and find detox from alcohol problems or, mental health support. I got interested actually, how do we stop this from happening
right,
rather than continue trying to solve the symptoms. And so I actually looked a bit at family work and community work because I thought, well, what if our families were more supportive, or what if our communities were more supportive? Maybe people wouldn't end up on the streets.
right.
And so I did that for a few years, and then one of the kind of realizations I had through some research that I did actually, and with people who were street homeless, was that most of them had been in prison at some time. We interviewed hundreds of people who were homeless, and pretty much all of them had had some period of incarceration. And then I thought, well, so why aren't our prisons doing a better job at supporting people while
Right.
they're in prison so that they don't come out just to live on the streets again? So that led me into criminal justice work. And I was working actually setting up a drug treatment program across a number of prisons when I also met Peter and got involved in dialogue work in prisons. So it was kind of, that was how it came about. And that was back in 1999, so the last century, as we say.
Yeah, yeah, 20 some years.
Mm.
So I think, Nancy, you said you wanted to ask the first question. You had something.
Yeah, I really was interested. You've been talking about social work, Jane. So
Mm.
I'm just interested what in your young life or your
Yeah,
background
well,
led you to seeing social work as what you wanted to focus on.
that's a really good question. Let's see.
And it's kind of a hard question too, to think about what went on there early on that you thought social work was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess there's a few things I'm very conscious of, and maybe if I start with them, maybe some other things will come to mind. Um, One was so my parents were very young when I was born. I mean, they were kind of teenage parents, and we started life. My early memories, we were living with my grandparents, so it was a very very safe upbringing, but one that my family were definitely on a kind of journey of improvement. I think when I was born, my father was worked mowing grass in the local town. That was his job. So I kind of experienced a family that was, increasing in affluence, I guess, and taking advantage of opportunity. So that was in my own life. The other thing I experienced was moving. So this may not sound like a big deal, but it was in the 1970s when I was young that we moved from the very north of England down to the very south of England. And there I remember moving from one kind of way of learning to read and write at school to a very different way of learning to read and write. and at the age of about 7, I would have been feeling like just really ashamed and embarrassed in school and in the community, because just simple things like how we were learning to read, I thought about it differently. And I just remember really, like feeling like I didn't fit in. I do remember kids saying to me, and Martin, this will make you laugh, because I had a northern accent, kids saying to me, well, are you Chinese? What's this strange accent? Are you Chinese? And so I had a kind of a range of different things of feeling like I didn't quite fit in as well. And I think actually, as much as social work, they're particularly working with people who were unhoused, because my experience working with them was that they didn't fit in. It wasn't, some of it was about housing, but there was just a whole question of how they felt really, really on the edge of our community. So I think they're some of the interesting. The other experience, of course, is, I went to a very ordinary state-run school, and then I went to Oxford University. And for those people that don't know, Oxford University in the UK, very much, our current Prime Minister went there. So it's people who are privately educated from wealthy families still, and certainly when I went. So I was repeatedly a bit like a fish out of water in an unfamiliar environment. And I think that was quite a big drive. And so I think in social work, I was looking for ways in which to make everything fit better and be more coherent and harmonious for people, I think.
Yeah.
I've never thought of the harmonious thing before, Nancy.
That's a lovely way to think about it. How do I fit in? How do others fit in? It is interesting how where the way we grew up in a way has influenced what we see as important in life. I like that. Yeah.
And I also think for me, and I think I mentioned it at the end of Jim Tebby's interview when you were saying Jane will be here next time, because of course he was talking about model building and how we each have our different practice and models and what have you. And I know you've interviewed many people who've written books and done a lot of research and are quite academic. And I think my work has developed in a very practical, hands-on way, working, as I say, at the coalface. And I think that's just because of who I am and the, the life experiences I've had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've had to really adjust to so many different environments. So your ability to bring those practical communication skills to bear, you had to learn them yourself, right? So
yeah. How do you fit in? How do you talk to people? And some of it, all the my experiences going into Oxford from a kind of a very different background myself are quite particular to an English educational system, I know, but the stories are quite interesting. Anyway.
Well, to change more into your work in prison work, doing your offender resettlement journey, I was just struck really at the very beginning of your article. You talk about rehabilitation being the primary goal, right, of prison, and yet really no one's responsible for the rehabilitation work, right? I mean, I didn't see anywhere in your story where there were people responsible for the actual rehabilitation. I mean, maybe partially, I could imagine people coming in off the street who had drug problems, alcohol problems. There were people there to counsel them, correct? But there wasn't anyone really following them all the way through.
Yeah, well, what tends to happen is, and it will vary in different systems, people here from Virginia have their own way of doing it. If I talk about the UK, which few of you will be aware of, it will very much depend on the political kind of attitude towards offending. So as I say, I've worked in prisons for over 20 years, and there have been times when there was very little or nothing happening. And then times when there's been a real focus on rehabilitation. But even during those times, I mean, in the UK, we used to have a role called the offender manager, and their job is to track what happens with the offender as they progress through the system. But it's more administrative, really. Mm-hmm. you know, maybe they'll interview them, they'll check they've got, you know, somewhere to live when they're coming out of prison. They'll want to know, you know, what they're thinking of doing around housing and whether they're mixing with old associates. But they're not necessarily talking one-to-one with the offender all the way through. So, you know, the offenders are then, or the prisoners, at different parts of their journey, they're talking and being supported by or living with or just a whole range of different people. So at the beginning, it will be the police who arrest them and the custody sergeant in the police station, and then they'll probably see a solicitor, and then they'll, you know, go to court, and if they've been in trouble before, they might have a probation officer or they may not, and then so you go on, and right through, it's just they're handed from one person to another, right, to another, to another, and the only person that has that whole experience is the offender themselves. Right. And even where in systems where you do have one person like this offender manager, their responsibility is more administrative than kind of, you know, support. You know, I'm not going to hold your hand all the way through. I need you to tell me what you're going to do next week, kind of thing. So it's a different relationship.
That was so interesting to me because part of my background early in my 20s, I was a product development manager, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I would actually do market research to make sure there was a need for the product. Then I would follow the development of the product all the way through and then make sure that it went to market successfully. And then even do post research, you know, is it satisfying the needs that we thought? You don't have that in a prison where people are the product.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you know, a prison is a really complex organization because in a prison, not only do you have the people who are responsible for rehabilitation or programming or security, but you also have people running kitchens and, you know, garbage kind of collection and making sure kind of deliveries of toiletries and toilet roll and cleaning, and, you know, there's all that stuff happening. And so working with prisons over the years, not just in the offender resettlement journey, we were trying to with them taking a dialogic approach, think how they could do everything that they do in a way that supports rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. This is going to sound like a really weird thing, but, you know, even as such as, I remember being in a dialogue where the prisoners were complaining about the quality of toilet roll, and then thinking, you know, the staff and the prisoners then saying, well, if we're to be responsible for ourselves, maybe you could make it available better quality toilet roll that we can buy ourselves. Now, what a little thing, but it's me as an adult being responsible that I want to spend my money on better quality toilet roll, then I can do that rather than just being given whatever we give people. So just thinking that everything can be done in a way that makes people more responsible for their actions.
Yeah, yeah.
I think some of the people on the call may not know about the Offender Resettlement Journey. So maybe it would be helpful, Jane, if you just spend a few minutes sort of explaining what that is and how you do it.
Okay.
Kind of give some context.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I'm very conscious the sun's shining and going. So one thing is that the idea of the Offender Resettlement Journey is whatever you do in terms of processes and facilitation, it's just the concept that actually we're all on a journey. So just as I am in my life, and I described helpfully my journey into this work, all of us are, and every offender is. And so, you know, the goal is to support them on that journey so that they can end up being responsible citizens, contributing to the community rather than reoffending and creating more victims and etc. And dependent rather and to be independent, not dependent. So there's that concept overall. And so working with Peter, who I know is on the call, very closely over the last 20 years, in that work with prisons and prisoners and in dialogue, we were very thoughtful about the importance of a positive storyline for those prisoners that we were working with. and then looking at how our work could support a positive storyline to work out for them. And we did that in all sorts of ways. And over the years, in I think probably in the mid-2000s, probably about 15 years ago, we then started to facilitate sessions that were specifically looking at the journey. So we went from a kind of concept that was ongoing in all of our dialogue work in prisons to how do you really design something that addresses this journey quite particularly. And then we ended up with the Offender Resettlement Journey that people talk about. And that's a facilitated process in which you get, you invite all the different stakeholders that are part of the criminal justice system supporting the offender. You spatialize them in a room, which means in a slightly chaotic way, you get people to work out, well, if you work in high security end of this system, you go down that end. Down this end, we're in the community. It's quite hard to, if we were in a room, we could move around and you'd see. We say, this is the prison gate. And we put some tape or tables or chairs to mark where the prison gate is. And then we ask people to kind of organize themselves. So if you're high security prison, you go to the far end. If you're if you work in a prison where you're supporting people just before release, come closer to the gate. If you work in an agency that helps people just when they come out, you come this side of the gate. And actually, if you're an employer employing people in the community or you provide housing or whatever, you'd be further away from the prison gate. So you start to get that kind of the journey from community into incarceration. And you get that spatialized like a catwalk. So you can walk up and down the middle. And then we would, in quite a delicate way, which I haven't got time to explain, but with some real sensitivity, you would work with an offender, an ex-offender, perhaps, could be somebody who's still incarcerated or somebody who's come out into the community. And they tell their story. And as they're doing that, you walk with them along the catwalk from the community into prison and back, and then in prison and then back out again. And you do it slowly over like 45 minutes, something like that. And each step of the way, you're helping them to tell, describe what happened to them. But because you're doing it with agency representatives around, and because you're walking and talking, then suddenly the system starts to show up in the room. And you would not believe the power of this bit of tape across the floor. And you're saying, right, let's just walk over the tape. Oh, I don't know if I want to walk over the tape, because it really starts to become alive. And the memories become very present. We've all got this memory bank and it becomes very present for people. And once having done that, what, of course, all the agencies are doing is recognizing the human story that they are part of. So I'm doing my job, but actually I'm part of supporting this human story. And then that leads people to think differently about the role that they have. And then you can take that thinking through into, planning service improvements, etc. So it can be quite a long process that can go then over, we've done some in Virginia, people here probably involved, that over a kind of, a year-long period, you go from seeing that journey, being moved and stimulated by it, to then starting to really look at how you provide your services and then improving them. So that's it's a big thing, and I've been very brief, but you'll see.
So Jane, when you are walking people along the catwalk,
yeah,
would they speak with the various representatives of the agencies?
Yeah,
so you facilitate a dialogue between them?
Well, what you tend to do, and it kind of depends, but you're both talking quite intimately. A bit like, I think I got a Nancy, when you were asking me about my childhood, I felt like it was one of those moments, how did you become a social worker? A bit like that as you're facilitating, but you are conscious you have this audience.
Right.
And so you're wanting people to feel comfortable and at ease, but also safe with you to be genuine and open, but also not make themselves vulnerable. And then as you move, you think there may be points at which it's really helpful just to bring, you don't do it all the time, but there may be a moment, perhaps you have a judge there, and the point at which they're talking about being given their sentence, you might say to the judge, do you know, were you there? Do you know this person? Or you may have a family member there as well. You may turn around and just say, were you there in court? Can you remember hear from them? So you might just pick out, and you'll tell from the person, pick out one or two events when it will be useful just to draw in the audience. It might also be sometimes it goes on and you think, oh, I'm losing my audience here, and let's turn to them and say, well, did any of you know Nancy when she was incarcerated? You know, what kind of a inmate was she? Was she well behaved? Was she troublesome? So you're just aware of the whole dynamic, the individual, yourself, you're feeling it, you're noticing what's going on, and you just make choices about, you know, what you think is going to help to bring things out and help to keep everybody engaged. It's an art, I think.
It would be, yeah. So I'm just trying to imagine this. So 45 minutes, you walk them through the catwalk, and then after that is over, would you then go back into the circle with everyone there and kind of debrief together?
Yeah, what you do is it's usually a huge sense of relief from them. You know, they're released, they're back into the community again, claps, and there's usually a few hugs. And then we might just get the audience just to turn to somebody next to you, because first of all there is an emotional processing to do, so just turn to somebody next to you and you know, just talk about what you're thinking and feeling, and we may have a number of different walks to do, so it depends. And then usually perhaps everybody together in a dialogue, or maybe if you're in a process where you are really looking to go to service development and action, you might start to, you know, kind of create some groupings around that. But yeah, you'd go into a dialogue process in some way. But first of all, there's usually just some emotional response that you need to let to be processed.
So I want to ask you two questions that are in my mind related. The first one is that you use the term offender. And I know you don't say prisoner, and sometimes I hear inmate. Yeah. So talk about the significance of the terms.
Yeah. It's a really good one. So actually, when having worked with prisoners for many years, it would always just be prisoners. You know, and for me, having worked with prisoners, it's because they say, you know, it's like you're labeling me as somebody who's committed an offence. It's very hard to move on from that, you know, kind of part of my life if you keep calling me an offender, even an ex-offender. I don't want that label. You know, when I'm a prisoner, I am in prison, so that, you know, is clear to me. The use of the term offender really, for me, came out of the work in the UK, when they actually renamed our prison service, was called the National Offender Management Service. So the whole language in this country changed to talking about offenders and ex-offenders. So it really came out of that. So it was recognised and acknowledged. You know, I mean, in other systems, I know in Virginia, though I know I've heard recently it's changed, they're using inmate more, but they talk about returning citizens and returned citizens. A prison that we worked in here in the UK, they were just talking about the men that live in the prison, the men that work in the prison, you know. So the labelling is kind of unhelpful, but it really depends on your audience. Like, you know, if you're trying to get the UK prison service or the UK National Offender Management Service to be interested, calling it an Offender Resettlement Journey, you know, has more value than calling it a returned citizen journey. They wouldn't get it. So that's the significance. I prefer just talking about people, men, women. It just
we lost a little bit of what we lost a little bit of what
for a minute.
You said there.
Yeah,
we lost a little bit, Jane, of what you said there because you froze for a few minutes. Say that part again.
And what I was saying was the use of the name is in some ways about the audience, for the work. What we would often do in the dialogue, and sometimes in Virginia we did it actually before we're doing Offender Resettlement Journey, is actually have a dialogue about the language. What word do you use to get people to think? Because it's both helpful and unhelpful, these kind of labels.
Yeah. So let me also then, just tied to that, or at least tied to that in my mind, it's about the values, your values and beliefs that support that. And I know when I was interviewing Harold Clark, I asked him, what were those values? And he's kind of clear about those, things like everyone deserves a second chance, or all voices need to be heard. So I'm just wondering for you, what's the underlying value system that you hold that encourages you to do this work, or that are important to you in the way you do the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one for me is probably respect, if I was to pick one out. So, the respect is that, people are where they are for a reason that made sense to them when they did it. They commit an offence, they are where they are in their life for all the things that came before. What was the storyline? What are the experiences they had that lead them to be where they are? And then by how you contribute or help their storyline move on, you can lead to something different happening. So, so my work is always about how do I engage, intervene, talk, contribute, participate in some way in this person's life to help something different happen. I think that's the main thing, and and therefore everybody should have a chance, and everybody can make something different of their lives.
Yeah. So it's that the underlying idea I think I hear here is that everyone's on a journey.
Yeah.
And you talked about your journey. So, and so the fact that they are not an offender. They are a person that's a part of their journey, and you're going to help them try to move to another part.
Yeah,
I mean, respect who they are.
Yeah, I mean, just as we are. I didn't know Linda. I think I met you in 2017. Nancy, I met you a couple of years ago, and we've met each other. We're working together in different ways through the academy. And knowing you is changing who I am and what I'm doing. And I hope in some way I can contribute to how your work and lives are moving on. So, and somebody who's come through prison and committed offences and has had different struggles in their life, it's just no different.
Yeah. What really occurred to me in hearing about your own journey is that it seems like in a prison, you've got a pretty frozen situation where people are kind of fixed in their identities, their roles. And as I listen to you, I really get that you see your role as kind of helping to break up that frozenness and just find the humanity amongst both the people working in the prison and then the prisoners, which leads me to wonder when you were doing some of the dialogues, maybe early on, when maybe it was pre the entire offender journey, you would talk about how the prisoners would first start to open up and talk about, well, the food's terrible here, or the toilet paper's, it's not good enough. It kind of reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, in other words, they have to start somewhere. For them to take back what they need to take care of themselves, of course, they would start with those needs. But then suddenly they would start to come out more, and they'd start to realize, oh, I could be talking about how I could make real changes on the inside of me so that maybe I wouldn't end up here again if I get out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really kind of delighted in, as well as that, so that change would happen. You'd start complaining about the food, and then you'd get into more kind of, I guess, it's quite important. Not having good food is quite important. It's not to diminish that, but perhaps then more kind of profound things about people's lives. But also the fact that then people would notice that they were doing that. You know, I used to love that when the prisoners would be in and they'd say, oh my God, why are we doing this again? Why are we starting complaining about all the things that we know will not change? Why is it? Well, maybe it's just helpful that we do that. Let's just consciously do that. You know, they wouldn't use that term, but yeah, let's just do that. But let's not do it for more than 10 minutes. Okay, and then let's move on. So helping them to develop the awareness of those different cycles in the way that they were talking, or, you know, so kind of, and then similarly, so that was one, was how to move from the kind of just the basic complainy stuff into something else. And then the other one was about talking about people who weren't there. I used to really like that, because you'd always want to complain about your probation officer or the, you know, person that was running the prison or the somebody or other. And it was one of our had very few ground rules, but one was that you don't name people. So you wouldn't say that Linda, you know, she's our the prison officer on my wing, she's a pain or whatever. But you might talk about a difficult officer. And then we'd say, well, actually, what would it be like not to talk about people who aren't here? You know, and actually, if we want to talk about prison staff, let's invite some of them in. And if they're in, then they can put their point of view. And again, getting the prisoners to notice that, rather than, because one thing is I facilitate it, I make it happen. I say, you can't talk about that. And then I invite some people along and then we talk about it. But it's very different if they say, actually, it doesn't, we're doing it again, complaining about the prison staff. Can't we have them along? So that, if you see what I mean, that kind of developing awareness and consciousness from the prisoners, as much as the conversation, it was their awareness about how their conversation was moving.
So just to follow on that, would you get defensiveness from the staff? I mean, if they would be complaining about something that the staff was responsible for, have that sort of difficulty in the container?
Yeah. I think Peter's here somewhere. I know we were talking about this yesterday, actually. There was one guy, he used to run the kitchens in a prison where we ran dialogues for years. And he would say, what I do when they come and complain about the food, I just imagine a brick wall. And I just think of them as a brick wall. I don't, you know, don't take in what they're saying. I don't think of them as people. I just think about a brick wall. So defensiveness and ways of managing defensiveness. But then that's part of the skill of the process, is to, you know, to enable people to listen to each other and understand. And for the prisoners to understand, well, it's kind of, this is quite tough work, and it's demoralizing sometimes, and it's long hours or whatever. And also for the staff to take on, yeah, I do get fed up with them complaining all the time, but actually, you know, I don't think I would eat that food. You know? So actually, do you know what I mean? I mean, that's the thing, to get the common understanding.
Did some of those things improve because they complained about it?
I mean, some things did improve over the years, working in different places. Yeah, absolutely. What used to be funny is sometimes things would improve and then nobody quite wanted to admit that it was because of the dialogue. I have specific examples of that where, yeah, things would happen and it would come out later how it had related to what happened in the dialogue, but nobody wanted to know it was because of that. Anyway.
That's great.
So when we were talking yesterday in the meeting we were both in, and people were talking about how they came to dialogue, and one of the things that you said that really intrigued me was you said in organizations things don't shift, and so will you talk about a little bit about how it is that dialogue helps things shift in an organization, whether it's a prison or some other organization? What's the shift about, and how does dialogue impact that?
Yeah, well, you know, I guess from my experience, so, you know, talk about defensiveness. It can happen just if staff come with a petition or a proposal, or if your clients or your customers complain, or the normal kind of dynamic will be that people feel defensive. or, you know, or your manager comes to speak to you as a member of staff with, you know, something about what you're doing. It's quite hard to really take it on without feeling threatened. And then you'll go back and talk to your colleagues and say, well, you know, it's, you know, no wonder, you know, Nancy's just really difficult. She's the worst manager I've ever had. You know, she doesn't really know what she's doing. Do you know what I mean? It's those kind of patterns that happen in a dialogue, because you're not directing it to one or another person, but actually all thinking together. It creates some spaciousness for you to take on board things on board. So people may be talking about, you know, not saying to you, I want you to improve the food, but maybe talking about the food, maybe talking about their, you know, just what's happening in the organization. And that space gives you the opportunity to think about it and to think about the implications and decide what you're going to do with it, do about it. You know, and that then leads to changes. So it's not petitioning, it's not, you know, it's not petition. I guess petitioning is the main thing that we try and get change, or from the other way, top down, it's enforcing new ways of things happening. You know, and then you get resistance and all that. It's actually people understanding each other's perspective and making decisions based on that common understanding. If you're more senior, you make a decision that has got implications for more people. If you're more junior, the decisions you're making are about how I can, in my position, how I can support what we're trying to do. So it just means that people act out of their own, you know, I guess, accountable for their own actions and act from their own position. Now, this sounds like it's just, oh, you get everybody in one big dialogue. It requires structure. It requires, you know, skill. But that's what you're going for. And all the things that I know we've talked about and Harold did and others have in Virginia are the kind of rigor that has enabled it to affect such a large organization.
And so will you just stay with that a minute and say, then in terms of your own facilitation of dialogue or setting up the dialogue, what do you do that helps that happen?
I think convening is really important. So understanding what you're trying to do and getting the right people into the dialogic process, or I call it that. I think convening is often underestimated, the value it has. I used to just use the simple term without teaching people a load of kind of complex stuff about dialogue. I just used to say to them, right, if we're talking about them, what they need to do, we need to invite them to our next meeting. So, you know, understand, you know, if you try to design a process and get all the right people into the process, but you can correct all the time by including, you know, the people, them, in what happens. So I think that's really important. And then I think you've got to design the right process. I mean, you know, I mean, we've written about that. Sorry, I can see messages when they pop up in the chat. Thank you, Glenna. Yeah, you kind of also design. It's not just, okay, these are all the people, let's get them into a dialogue. It's actually, well, what's the current need in this situation? Actually, what's meaningful to people? You know, what's the, I mean, one of the other papers I wrote for the conference a couple of years ago about a prison that was being privatized in the UK. You know, there it was right at the beginning, there was going to be a massive strike action, was, you know, on the cards, high risk of there being a strike. And so you had to understand the pain, understand the frustration, understand the risks that everybody was bringing, understand all the different people that you needed to convene, and then actually design a process to get them all talking and thinking together. So there is something about, it's not just a dialogue. And in that situation, I talked very carefully with everybody before we got them into the first meeting. And then we spent probably we had a dinner the night before. We spent a kind of half day on the first check-in, just to let people tell their story at length. So I think, without going on, it's really about understanding what the needs are, understanding the opportunity, understanding who needs to be there, designing a dialogic process that will address what needs to happen, and then can start to see how something generative can unfold for the future. That's hugely generalized.
I have a little bit of background noise, so I'm
okay.
getting my system on and off.
We have about 2 more minutes to ask a final question, Linda, and then we'll go into workout groups.
Oh, no. Well, yeah. I was going to ask you a little bit about the threshold dialogues you gave. If you could give a little context around that, and how it's different from the...
Yeah, well, those who are members of the Academy can listen to the recording from the conference and see the paper as well, because that's quite a long story. But it's a very good example, actually, of how do you design, how do you convene, and then how do you kind of design a process and facilitate individual sessions. Because it was supporting prisoners as they moved from prison into the community. Prisoners who were getting short sentences, so moving in and out of prison a lot. Mm-hmm. So that required an overall design that meant that, I have a slightly chaotic life, and I always know that every Tuesday I can go to a dialogue. If I'm in prison, it's in prison. If I'm in the community, it's at this community centre or this hostel. And then, so that was the kind of design that met the need. The convening was then, who are all the stakeholders? We've got to get the police, they're key here, the prison staff, drug treatment and housing, and the local municipality or government, and understanding who those people were and getting them involved, but a magistrate. And then each dialogue itself would have a design. So, okay, what is it that it's really important to talk about? People are really talking about, how do I get myself a job, or, my relationship with my kids when I come back out, how am I going to manage that? Or, so that it's a very good example. We haven't got time for now. It's a very good example of how the overall process has a design and a convening, and then each individual session has a design and a convening. So you have to come back another time to hear about that.
Yes, there's so much to explore there. It reminded me a little bit of 12-step programs and how incredibly useful something would be like that for this population. But it needs to be ongoing, and then that leads to how do you sustain it, and on and on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we should now ask Bobby to put us into breakout groups, so we have some time. And in your breakout groups, if you could think about what Jane has said, reflect on it yourselves. Maybe you have some comments that when we come out of the breakout you want to make to Jane, or you may have questions. So if Bobby, if you will do that, then
Nancy, can I make a suggestion? I mean, on the one hand, I'm very happy to answer questions about the work I've done and whatever. But also, I'd just be really interested for people to think about their own answer to the kind of question you were asking me about, how I end up doing the work I'm doing. Be a really interesting inquiry for everybody. How do you end up doing the work you're doing? And what's, and how does dialogue kind of fit into that? If they'd like to, but
some great story.
Very nice. All right. So, Bobby, will you move us?
Hi.
Right. I think we're all present. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to kind of do two things. We're going to have specific questions for Jane. Please, if you wouldn't mind, put them in the chat, and we'll find them there and then call on you. Other than that, though, we'd just like you to maybe raise your hands, and Nancy and I will be looking, and maybe Bobby too, to help us out. And we'll just kind of create a little dialogue here, because we have no idea what you guys talked about in your groups. We'd like to know. we had a very wonderful chat, getting to know each other a little bit more.
So who would like to start? Who has something they'd like to say?
Jenny.
Martin has his hand up.
Martin.
Martin.
Yes, here I am.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
how can I take my hands off?
Yes, please go ahead, Martin.
All right. Sorry, Jen, I heard you talk about when you moved from North England to South, that you were having experience of kind of discrimination or something, or the cultural difference. Now, how do you handle that when you were that little?
That little. It was difficult. I mean, it really was difficult. I think one of the most difficult things actually was seeing that it was difficult for my parents. So I remember going shopping with my mum and my mum trying to ask for something and people not understanding her. It does sound mad because we're not a big country, but it was very different. And as a child, I tried to find one or two people that I was friends with, and I got in trouble a bit. You know, I mean, I did. I you know, stole things from a shop, and got in trouble about that, and tried to find one or two people that I could feel close to. So some good stuff and some bad stuff, and battled through it. I probably developed some resilience as well. So yeah, it's interesting because as a kid I didn't think. As an adult you think, well, how do I handle this? I didn't think about that. I just kind of acted more instinctively. Yeah.
And I also want to know what's the difference between North and South, or accent or different things. What are the difference?
Yeah. So now I think these days with media the way it is, everybody speaks the same language, and it's American. I don't know, but no. So it would be different words. So accent was different, but also different words for things. So a different, you know, just, I mean, I remember one would be something like trainers. You know, like trainers, which everybody knows now. Oh, Ross is from Newcastle in the north of England, and no one can understand us. Yeah, so that's where I was from outside Newcastle, Ross. For when you're there, I can't see. Oh, there, hi. So you know, so in the north of England, trainers were called sand shoes, and you go down to the south of England then, and this is where I remember my mum trying to buy me sand shoes in the shop, and somebody just said, "I don't know what you're talking about." So there's actual different words for things.
I understand. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Lauren has her hand up. Let's call on her.
Thanks. A quick funny story too about English words. I lived in England for a little bit as a child, and I remember one time the teacher said, "Okay, everyone, get out your plimsolls." Yeah. And I took out my pencils, and I couldn't figure out what people were. Anyway, yeah, thank you for this. And for your work, and the interview was very helpful because I read a couple of your papers and I really did have a hard time sort of seeing it in the concrete. So this has been really helpful. I guess my question is curiosity around, in addition to helping with the rehabilitation or you're not doing the rehabilitation, but the settlement, do you help anyone, so which is really helping an individual, like as you talked about it, here's an individual, here's their story, how do we help them change their story and help them create a new story that's going to be really positive, right? So that's very much on the individual. And I was wondering if you ever worked at all with sort of the structural changes. So, I mean, we also have dominant cultural narratives, right, that feed into the structures of oppression.
Yeah.
And I was just curious as to whether issues like this ever came up, which obviously would be a little more challenging, but just in terms of helping people be aware of these narratives that feed into the structures of oppression.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the idea of the storyline and helping somebody change their storyline in a dialogue in a prison. So, way back 20 years ago, regularly in dialogues with a lot of prisoners and some staff and managers and some guests. And there would be kind of meeting and talking and thinking together. And there you would expect, and I saw individual prisoners shifting their own storyline. When you then come to the more recent work, and if you've read the Offender Resettlement Journey paper, the individual who's telling their story is really to get us all thinking about the system. Now, it is their story, but what you start to see are some archetypal moments in that system. So when they're sentenced, when they arrive in prison, when they get in trouble and end up in segregation, when they're waiting to hear whether they've been given parole or not. So, the crisis, we talk about a crisis as you go into prison, a crisis as you come out. So in the Offender Resettlement Journey process, that person they're telling their own personal story, but it's getting the people who work in the system to think about all the many people that they've dealt with and deal with. And that's when you start to get at the structural issues and in a way, the organizational narrative about how the organization is doing its work. And that's when you get those kind of shifts. So the Offender Resettlement Journey is absolutely about the organizations and structures. I know that you asked a bit more, which I probably need you to repeat, about the there was a bit more than that in your inquiry, was there?
Well, no, not really.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's really helpful, the way that you use the personal stories to expose the sort of larger the issues. I guess it was also how intentional are you? And maybe this isn't your role, and that's fine. But I'm just curious about, helping. So if somebody in the prison system hears a story and they might start thinking about the larger issue, yet they might not quite have been able to name it. So I guess it was more like, how explicit are you about helping people move from, oh yeah, I resonate with this, to there's this issue, and how do we actually change this dominant narrative at the top, not just my individual action, right? Maybe as somebody in the system. So
what you hope to do is exactly what you say, that you then structure interventions that start to make very deliberate changes. And I'm just looking at who's here from Virginia, but certainly in Virginia, that's what happened as a result of the Offender Resettlement Journey. So some quite big changes could start to be looked at. So absolutely, with the right leadership and the right organization, people will take that into, bigger change. I don't know if is Whitney here still? She might,
Whitney had to drop out.
Okay. Peter, do you want to say something?
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
And just say, Jane is my business partner. So I think I know her quite well. I think she's being rather modest in response to your question, Lauren. I'm thinking of an occasion a few years back where a city jail in the UK called Birmingham was in terrible shape. And eventually the government washed its hands of it, decided to privatize it, and gave it to a private company to try and bring back order and get it to function properly. So it was a failing prison with a very militant kind of trade union back of it, and all sorts of problems, rats running around the place, a Victorian old building. When the contract was handed over for privatization, we took on the role of changing the culture. It was a formal contract to change the culture in the prison. I worked on the outside, but Jane worked on the inside of the prison. And her primary method is conversation. She just likes people and the journey they're on. and go on a taxi ride with her, and at the end you'll know the driver's children, where they went on holiday, what football team they support, what they're hoping to do with their lives, you know. And with her wandering around that failing prison, she was not only talking with people, connecting with the right people, but raising the very issues that structurally needed to change, continually putting them together, whoever they were, with substantial structural changes going on in the prison. At the point where the final handover occurred, the expectation was right, and there were right troops ready to come into the prison. Nothing happened. It was an extraordinarily successful shift at all sorts of levels. Ended up as a very proud and very effective prison. So when Jane's talking about the offender resettlement journey, those are the essential skills within that, the understanding of the journey. But certainly they move from an interest in a person, I think, in Jane's work, right through to the structural levels. I could say the same about a dozen other situations which are quite remarkable. She's a very talented woman.
I'm embarrassed now.
Linda, do you want to call on someone?
You know, Lloyd asks an interesting question that might be apropos right now. Lloyd, would you see? Lloyd, where'd you go? I know you're still here, I think.
Lloyd, I can see him there.
Yeah, why don't you ask your question? I think it's be a good one to ask now about the kind of taking it to the next level outside of the prison work.
Okay, well, let's see, right now I can't see my question, but it was saying that I so appreciated your paper, Jane, and it especially meaningful having heard the conversations with Harold Clark. And at the end of your paper, you suggested that this journey process could be used in other fields.
Yeah.
And that's very exciting to me. And I know early on in your paper, you talk about the fragmentation, which is where David Bohm started looking at things. And I'm wondering if looking at deep problems, and two that seem particularly pertinent. I live in Minneapolis, so one of the big ones we're looking at here is reforming policing.
Wow.
And then for, you know, the all-time large one is climate crisis. And my question is, do you see this journeying process, can you imagine it being used in fields like that? And are you aware of anybody having attempted that?
Not around climate. The other area that Peter and I have done most work that draws on the offender resettlement journey kind of structure and process is in migration. So there we were looking at a cycle from leaving your home to, you know, the transition and outward journey to a new destination, and then to actually come home again. We were working in countries where there was so much migration, it was really affecting the fabric of the origin country. So we're looking at how would you make that journey work effectively for people to leave and come back, and that whole process be a positive one for everybody. So, and it was very effective in that environment and thinking, but I'm not aware of anything around climate. But I'd love to have the opportunity to think about it with people.
Well, that occurred to me.
Go ahead, Lloyd.
Okay. Well, that was the thing that I thought of when I read the final paragraph of your paper, that wouldn't it be wonderful to convene a group of people to play with these ideas and to explore them together and to see what we could do. And then my final question is, I'm working with some people now. I've just met some people who are working with immigrants. And I would love to hear more of what you have done and what is available. So how can I make connection with that?
Email me.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
This is date night.
Yes. Well, if I could
Can I just say, I can see little messages popping up in chat. I'm ignoring that, so apologies if it.
Yeah.
We'll track it all later. Thank you. Sorry, Linda.
Well,
Yeah,
I think in chat.
Let me come in response to Lloyd's question, because I've done those kinds of what we thought of as patient journeys through the entry into a hospital and out again, and also the same kind of a journey with people who are in the Defense Intelligence Agency, who are being sent to different countries to collect data on the country, and how they go through the system to get there. So I think it's a process that's really applicable to many situations. The journey that people take, and it's so informative. So let me turn it back to Linda again.
Well, I just saw that we had a question in the chat from Leo, who is from a Maine state prison, who's also asking for more detail, Jane. And I'm just, Leo, maybe you can say a little bit about what you're doing, and it's very interesting. You're on chat. You're on mute.
Yes. Yeah. So hi. Thank you. I'm Leo. I have been incarcerated for going on 13 years. I was a foster child from 10 to 18, and then 5 weeks after my 18th birthday, I committed the crime that earned me 50 years in prison. I'll be 31 tomorrow, and over the course of these last 10 years or so, part of what we discussed in our breakout group was the ability to, or the inability to articulate any feelings underneath anger. So hurt, pain, betrayal, things like that. So how all of those things tend to manifest in aggression. And so a lot of the work that I do here, and I've learned to do over the last number of years, is I do a lot of personal counseling, but I also sit on the Restorative Justice or Restorative Practices Steering Committee, where we are working to see how we can institute restorative and transformative justice practices within this system. And I'm actually working on a master's degree where beyond this, I'm looking to change the criminal justice system as a whole to better reflect restorative and transformative justice principles and practices. So I'm looking for any help that I can get in how to forward these efforts to change the culture, because that's what needs to change, is the mindset at every level, whether prisoner, staff, administration, and societally, the societal narrative needs to change. So any help that you can offer, I'm very, very open.
Good. We'll be in touch then. You know, it sounds like you have exactly the right kind of idea and approach in what you're saying about shifting the mindset, shifting the culture. Everybody has to be part of that. So I'd love to support that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Hugh has his hand up. Hugh?
Just before we run out of time, I wanted to make sure I had the opportunity of asking Jane about herself. Because there are qualities you have, Jane, which are hidden, it seems to me, behind the structures you follow and the thinking you put into the design and so on, which I wanted to just check with you, because if I just take one example, you spoke about recognizing that it's important to understand that an offender, the action that an offender might have taken makes sense to them when they did it. And I remember something that Cliff Penwell described, somebody he was working with, who he described as having the willingness to be moved by the truth of the other. And I was struck then by the clarity with which that describes the qualities, the character of the person he was describing. And I could attribute those same words to you. It seems to me that you have a willingness to be moved by the truth of the other. And it's that they're responding to, as much as the design and the convening and all of those things. Rather than just attribute that to you, I thought I would ask you whether you would accept the attribution.
Mm-hmm. I accept the attribution. Funny, do you know, I'm getting some feedback. Robbie, can you help? I don't.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to have to mute whilst.
Okay, thank you. One of the other things in my story is that in my family, if you were too kind of proud of yourself, you would get a kind of, it was always quite teasing, but it's, you know, you were kind of gently kind of told to contain your ego. So I find anything that, even when Peter was talking earlier, I find that quite uncomfortable. So it's probably easier for me to talk about structures and processes and all that stuff than about myself. So I accept your comments and thank you for it. But that's one of the reasons.
Well, I'm noticing a question, Stephanie, that you have. It's a short one. Maybe you can ask it. And we have just a few more minutes left before we're going to introduce our next speaker. And you're on mute. There you go.
Thank you. Jane, hello again.
Hi.
So in our breakout group, we were discussing, you know, where the reentry officer would be. DJ was in my group, DJ Cook, who's also on here. She's the reentry officer. And so we were discussing how really I feel like you straddle that line of, you're a probation officer in the community, but you're going back across the line to really work with, you know, an inmate to be, you know, before they come out as a probationer. And so I just didn't know, on the technical side, would you consider them on the community, even though they're really doing like half and half?
Yeah, I mean, I would sit you on the line. Absolutely. I think those sort of roles, I don't know how long they've been in Virginia. How long have the kind of re-entry officers been in Virginia, Stephanie? Do you know?
I don't know. Maybe DJ knows if she's still on here.
Laura can tell you because I'm the original senior reentry PO, and I got my job in May of 2011.
2000, so 10 years was the beginning of it. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had transition staff in the years before that, but right after Director Clark came on board, he was part of these positions being developed and implemented. And like DJ, we're the bridge from the institution to the community. So
yeah, and I think that's you know, probably a similar time in the UK. It's obviously a kind of innovative thinking in criminal justice 10 years ago or so. Those kind of roles that crossed prison into the community and were able to support, because up till that point it was like you saw one group of people when you were in prison, and then you went into the community and you saw other people, and the people that worked in the community had no idea about what your experience was like in prison, and the people in prison didn't really know what you were going to face when you came out into the community. So I think those roles, you should be right on that line, and I think that's, you know, you're quite unique in that you see both sides. So, and I think they're great roles and important.
Probably worth mentioning that most offenders are never incarcerated. Yeah. The large majority never go into prison. And I know Jane's done offender resettlement journeys just in the community. You still need a resettlement process for an offender in the community. So gathering the different community agencies and families and so on, and following just the same journey in the community is one of the reasons why it's offender resettlement journey rather than prisoner resettlement journey, because a lot of it's community-based.
I've been having fun looking at the back and forth in the chats. Wonderful. Lot of it with Leo. Thomas Klug, do you have anything you want to ask Jane with respect to your question on migration? Or
well, there was the conversation in the chat with migration and also here. And my question was, if you do the journey in resettlement, can we also enlarge that journey fully into community, not only with relation to prisons, but to the connection of all the different parties in a community, to overcome the gaps we have currently, not only in the US with the different political parties, but also in Europe between different groups that are coming up. Do you see a chance to expand this approach into the entire community, into the region, even far beyond the prison system?
And in terms of just the relationships between different subgroups in a community, or for an offender resettling, what were you thinking?
Yeah, in the relationship, and also one of the ideas you want to reach is the healing environment, as far as I can understand. Yeah. And I think that is necessary to bring people together again and to talk with each other and not only about each other. And I think that seems to be an approach we need more and more in these days. And can we also reach out far out of the prison system?
Yeah.
That's the question, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think in relation to the broader community and offenders, those kind of offender resettlement journeys include all sorts of people, from churches and community groups and housing groups and employers and anyone you can imagine that would be part of that kind of resettlement process of joining your community. It's often, Peter and I have talked about it often, that we almost feel that there should be, because who represents the community? When you look at the system, you get Harold Clark represents Virginia Community Department of Corrections, and you might have a police chief, or all these organizations have chiefs who can represent them. But who kind of represents the community as a figurehead to say, we welcome you back, we want you to do well, we want to do whatever we can to support that in you. Now, I guess you might have a mayor, maybe the mayor of a community might do that, but it's hard to find the person that owns that great diversity in a community and wants to see the whole thing work out well for everybody, and wants those citizens to be integrated and successful within their communities. I think we kind of, maybe it's different in Germany, but it's quite hard to find that person who would do that, who would be there to shake their hand. So I think with the resettlement journey for offenders, it has been happening, and we have examples of that in Virginia. And I think more broadly for the community, it's certainly an area that as I get older, I'm more interested in community governance and how we can, create interventions that, address some of the community divisions. And I haven't got so much experience of doing that, but I would love to, just more generally about how we live together.
That's lovely. Thank you, Jane. I'm going to turn it back to Linda now to talk about our next speaker, who will actually be on May 12th. So that's quite soon at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So it's a little different, both different part of the month and a different time. And you can now even, I think Bobby has put the possibility of going ahead and enrolling yourself in that. But Linda, will you talk about our new?
I will. We just spoke with him this week. So since he couldn't be here today, his name is Lee Nickel. He was the editor amazing of David Bohm directly for years. And he's going to be our next speaker. So we did a little clip of him. So I'm going to share my screen, get this set up for us. Here is Lee. Okay. Hey, Lee. So I know you can't be with us on our next interview, but we know you're coming in on May, and we're so excited to have you. Could you just say a little bit about what you'll be covering in our interview in May?
Yes, well, thank you, Linda, and thank you, Nancy, both for inviting me. I'm happy to be joining you. And I think the short version of what we'll try to open up in subsequent sessions is specifically Bohmian dialogue, as I came to understand it from working with him directly over a period of 12 years. and the many facets and different tendrils that are really involved in a sustained and deep sensibility of what he was trying to achieve in his work with dialogue. There's a lot that often gets left out and kind of shaved away when people work with Bohemian dialogue. And what I would hope to do in our session is to, best as we can in that time frame, give a picture of the whole of what he meant, such that I understand it from working with him during that period. So that's really what we'll try to do. And I will look forward to being with you when we have the session.
Thank you, Lee, so much. We look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll see you in May.
Great.
All right.
I think that's perfect.
Yeah, so now we're going to move towards checking out. And this is really a time for really any of us to just say last comments, anything we'd like to say to Jane about her interview, anything we've learned, any ahas, anything that stood out that you'd like to share with the group. Just raise your hand and we will try to see it and call on you.
And everyone could unmute at this point. So when you're ready, we can still call on you, but then we don't have to say, would you please unmute? So if you go ahead and unmute yourself now, that would be great.
I was just going to say one thing following what we were just talking about before we introduced Lee, which is, it came to my attention. In fact, Annette, I think, is on this session with me. Yeah, we both were on something that's airing every day during the weekdays called Humanity Rising. Joe Jaworski was on something. I think it was on Tuesday's session, along with what's her name?
Ann Ansler.
Thank you. Yes, and Joe made the point that the report has just been made by the National Intelligence Agency, the NIA, to Biden, that said that social fragmentation was one of the U.S.'s security issues right now. So this whole thing about fragmentation, you know, is huge. It's everywhere. And I think Jane's session today was really lovely because it shows the role that dialogue can play. That's my big aha. So who else would like to check out and just tell us what you're thinking?
And you're welcome just to speak out. You don't need to.
Yeah, just.
Yeah, so for me personally, this has just been a really encouraging couple hours to see how many interested parties there are to discuss change and to see what's possible. And it's just very uplifting and encouraging for me to know that it's not just the few of us here who are pushing for change from the inside, but that there are people on the outside who see the need for change, who see the need for humanity to be introduced into this system of oppression. So thank you for this.
Very happy you found us, Leo.
Me too. I don't know if any of you know him, Jim Snow. He made the recommendation, sent me the email, and so thank you.
Brilliant.
Maybe I can say something. When Leo talked, it made me think that there is a journey inside the prison for people who have a long sentence. They can change their life within the walls. So there is a sort of a resettlement journey within as well. And that's quite fascinating. And I've always been touched when I've met inmates. In Canada, we had a task force at one point called the ex-offenders as a correctional manpower resource. And they were about offenders who, even if they stayed in prison, they became rehabilitation agents for people in prison. It was quite amazing. So it's a turnaround of one's life and within. So, thank you.
Yes, I think in VADOC, there's a mentoring system, prisoners mentoring other prisoners. I'd like to learn more about that.
Nancy, can I ask if there's going to be a list of emails?
I think we're not permitted to send the emails of everybody to everybody else. But
Okay.
if you send me a note and say you would like to have other emails, I can send your email to other people. Or if other people send me a note and say we'd like to be able to share emails with each other, I can do that.
Okay. Okay.
Only if
Fair
you
enough.
send me an email and give me that permission.
I'll do it. Thank you.
And for any of us who are members of the Academy, we can send each other emails on the website. So that's available as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Be interesting to hear a word from Katrina Pugh. Are you going to say good evening to Jane?
It is a delight to be here. So I used to work with Peter and Bill 20 years ago. And on a very special occasion, I went to visit Peter in Chipping on Camden, and I met Jane. And it was really formative. And I'm continuing to do dialogue and facilitation together. And I'm just delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Really nice to see you again. We're aging okay, aren't we, in 20 years?
You're looking fabulous. Yes. And I
My
actually
hair's a lot grayer.
and I happen to be at the present in Orono, Maine, which is not far from where Leo is. And I know Warren very well because my homestead is in Friendship, Maine. So Leo, there will be an opportunity for us to meet sometime in the near future.
I would very much like that.
I'd actually like to take the opportunity to ask Parvin to say a little bit about what she's doing. I think you're from Iran, is that correct? I was in a wonderful session with Parvin in a session, the Dialogue Summit, I think it was called last summer. And somehow you found your way to the Academy. So that's great. Can you say a little bit about what you're doing in Iran?
Thank you, Linda. Yes, it's my honor to be here. Yeah, I'm from Iran, Tehran. I can say that I'm a dialogue facilitator, but I would like to learn more and more. This is a great opportunity for me to be here, and I'm learning from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad you found your way.
Oh, I would like to say that this interview was fascinating for me, and this experiment from Jane and dear Peter is very unique, and I would like to know more, and I'm going to read the article that I found it in the library in the Academy. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Peter.
Good, thank you.
I would just like to say to Hugh that I love your phrase that you said to Jane. I think it's true about Jane, but I wrote the phrase down, the willingness to be moved by the truth of the other is such a wonderful thought. It's beautiful.
Well, I think there are other attributes that Jane has, which I wouldn't want to embarrass her by enumerating them, but I think sometimes we underplay the care we might bring to defining what those qualities are, because if we foster the qualities in the relation, it affects the likelihood that the procedures that you are making and the convening arrangements that you're making will be the better supported. In other words, to be mindful of one's own qualities as well as the procedures that you're developing. And I like the modesty, Jane, but I think there is some teaching to be had from inviting you to ask of yourself, not how did I get into this, but what is it that keeps me here? And I think it's the qualities of relation that you manage to bring about that is very compelling, and I think people could learn from that if you were willing to articulate them. I'll stop embarrassing you now, but I think we miss it out sometimes, appreciating that these can be described as qualities that are contributory to the successful outcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to draw attention to echo here.
I want to say at last, I am Sadra Ameli. I am from Iran too, and we work for dialogue providing, and I find very interesting dialogue in prison, and I find very interesting the word journey and the work with the prisoner. But I am going to read more about it, that if there is the possibility that the prisoners speak about their problem, or they can do dialogue in the meaning of together thinking. Can they do too? It was very interesting. I was very happy to be here. I must learn more English. I like dialogue. I have in German a book translated from German to Persian about dialogue, and but I can speak English very well. I hope in the future I can share better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to point it out that Annette shared the little video clip that I was mentioning about how social fragmentation is the #1 problem in the US, if anyone wants to watch that. Sharon, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but in case you want to mention anything about your work in prisons and how this might, how you viewed what Jane's work, is accomplishing, that might be kind of interesting to hear from you. Sharon is a good friend of mine, and I never think of her as working in the criminal justice system, but you did.
I've done leadership training primarily, and so we, for many years, both one series of years and then a break and then another series of years, did leadership training with both staff and inmates in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Just at the time that the word rehabilitation became part of their name, which was a big deal. It was a big deal. It's like, what, rehabilitation? So that whole conflict that you were talking with, somebody had talked about, but what are we really here to do, was embodied in that word. What I was noticing when you talked, Jane, about the various things that you did is that although dialogue is kind of the framework and the thinking process for what it was you were doing, it was much more than people sitting in a circle talking. So journey exercise that you did, where people were doing an experiential exercise. And that was similar to the approach you took, where some of it was talk. I mean, I use dialogue in those sessions all the time, particularly around, I was using Kouzes and Posner's leadership model. So there's one of the practices is called challenge the process. So when we talk about challenging the process, we would have a dialogue essentially about how could you legitimately challenge the process from where you sit in this system, right? Your individual place in this system. So it was one of the things that we did. And I think it's really important, and what I heard and what you were doing, Jane, is you got to bring all your tools to bear in any of these situations. It's not just conversation, right? There are a lot of other modalities that can be very useful. And what makes it dialogue is not just the sitting in a circle talking, but the way you view it. So we brought training, essentially the process that we did, and then whatever, was going to work, essentially. And the other thing, we were talking about this in a small group, you know, my expertise is around leadership, and over the course of 30 odd years of working in that field, I've had different views about you know, top down, bottom up, middle across, you know, what's the way to do this. Our experience in the California department was that when the secretary, you know, the head of the system changed, everything changed. So it brings, you know, and that was part, that along with budget constraints were whether we were allowed in or not allowed in at any given point. We were always partnering with somebody who was inside the system as well. It was not just external consultants. So the role of the Harold Clark role, if you will, you know, in VADOC is critical, absolutely critical. Because there's a lot of control and a lot of power that sits in a position, and to acknowledge that is important, and then to try and get that on board is really important.
Thank you.
We are at the end of our time, unfortunately. Do you want to say one last word, Jane?
One last thing. The person who brought us into the system was a guy named Ken Hurdle, who was the chief ombudsman. So there was a voice for the inmate population. I mean, that was his role. And in that role, he brought us in. So that was also something that we haven't talked about, that buddy. He called himself the ombuddy. His job was to be their voice.
Could I, just say a thank you. Thank you, Linda and Nancy. Thank you for inviting me and for the kind of the inquiry that you made of me, which made me stop and think. We didn't prepare, so I had no idea what you were going to ask. So it was nice to be live on that. I'd like to just acknowledge Peter, who's spoken a bit, but I was in prisons already and, you know, wondering how I'd have an impact. And it was meeting Peter and ending up doing dialogue work in prisons with Peter. I was introduced to dialogue and David Bowman. The rest, as they say, is history. So in terms of significant moments in my journey, that was one of them. You know, without that, I'd be somewhere else, not here. And just thank you all for your comments. Leo, I don't know how you ended up here, but that's just wonderful. And Lloyd, let's all stay in touch and see what will happen with this kind of wonderful meeting that we've had. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
See you in May.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I had a quick thought, which was